grateful for the snow outside and just the beauty of your creation. Reveal your heart to us. Show us who you are, that we may love you more and that we may serve you in ways that are pleasing to you, and enjoy just who you are and in our relationship with you. In your name, amen. Okay, so
We're in color on you.
I know they didn't print off as color, but oh well, that's okay. We can do it in black and white. So anyone that listens to this on YouTube is not going to have the benefit of that at all, so too bad. So anyway, so last time we left off at, really we ended in chapter 12, verse 36. Probably a good thing that I didn't keep pushing forward. I thought, man, I could get this done, but it would have been not a pretty scene. So we stopped wisely, and we'll pick up there. We'll definitely, I think, finish chapter 12, maybe even start chapter 13 today. So I think that it's, when we look at this, and I said this last time, I think that it's appropriate to look at verse 36 of John chapter 12 as probably one of, if not the last public statement that Jesus made. It's really hard to be certain about that based off of the historical records that we have. But it's certainly close to that, if not the last statement. I think that John is essentially putting it as that. Okay, so we'll just go along with John in that. That was his last public statement. The statements that we see now from here on forward really are either summary statements of his public ministry, or they are statements that he has, or teachings that he has in a much more intimate setting, a setting like what we'd have here, maybe a little bit bigger with the 12 disciples. So I'm headed into the Last Supper. In fact, John 13 through chapter 17 is the most intimate and detailed description that we have of what we would consider the Last Supper. So obviously we're headed into that. And there's a lot of really cool things to learn there, lots of neat interactions, lots of wonderful things that Jesus says. Of course, on his mind is his death, which will ensue 12 hours after that, okay, or even shorter time span than that. So that's where we're headed. So we need to sum this whole public ministry up and look at the rest of chapter 12. And so we'll just pick up in verse 36, about halfway through. It says, "These things Jesus spoke, and he departed and hid himself from them. But though he had performed so many signs before them, yet they were not believing in him, that the word of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke, 'Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?' For this cause they could not believe, for Isaiah said, 'He has blinded their eyes, and he has hardened their hearts, lest they see with their eyes and perceive with their heart and be converted, and I heal them.' These things Isaiah said because he saw his glory and he spoke of him." All right. So we'll stop right there, and we'll think about what is being said here. John essentially quotes from two passages from the book of Isaiah. The first one that he quotes from is in verse 38. It's from Isaiah 53, verse 1. The second one that he quotes in is from Isaiah 6:10, and it's in verse 40. Okay. We'll look at that a little bit more closely. That's more of a paraphrase of that rather than a direct quotation. And you'll see some of the differences as we look at Isaiah 6 in that. What I find interesting about this is that Isaiah 6, which is quoted in verse 40, is really the beginning of Isaiah's ministry, the very beginning of Isaiah's ministry, okay, which was probably a 50-year ministry. The quote that we have in verse 38 is really the end of Isaiah's ministry, okay? And so what we see here, it's going to get a little noisy down there. Yeah, 7 children, 7 kids downstairs is a recipe for loudness. Anyway, so Isaiah 53, the very end of his ministry, or close to the end of his ministry. So here's what we'll want to do. Let's go ahead and flip to Isaiah and look at these passages. And there's a number of things that I think we need to say about them. But let's just first understand maybe what John is trying to say. He's essentially quoting these passages to indicate that this is the reason that many of the people that saw and experienced Jesus did not know who he was, or did not believe who he was. Okay, so this Isaiah 6 is where I'm having you flip. Some of you are like, I'm in Isaiah, but that's a huge book, and so you're going to have to give me a little bit more direction. It's 66 chapters. So anyway, Isaiah 6. Let me just read verse 1 of this, and then we'll skip to verse 8. But Isaiah 6:1 is the context. It says, in the year of King Uzziah's death, which is at the very beginning of Isaiah's ministry, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. He'll go on to then describe what he sees. He has essentially seen the throne room of God, something that very few human beings have seen. In fact, there's very few accounts in Scripture of people seeing that. Isaiah is one of them, Ezekiel's another one, and then John himself, actually in the book of Revelation, sees something to this effect. All of them have similarities in their descriptions. So, but when we look at John, he says in verse 41, he says, these things Isaiah said because he saw his glory and he spoke of him. That's John's referencing essentially the context of Isaiah 6. Okay. Now, skip down to verse 8 of Isaiah 6. And we have John in the throne room, and this is, not John, Isaiah in the throne room, and Isaiah says this, then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, send me, and raises his hand. Okay. And he said, so now God tells Isaiah this, go and tell this people, keep on listening, but do not perceive. Keep on looking, but do not understand. Render the hearts of this people insensitive. Now that word render, I'm going to come back to. A very important word, I think. Render their hearts, the hearts of this people insensitive, the ears dull, and their eyes dim, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return and be healed. Right, so what we have here is essentially, and what we could read on, I'm not going to read on any further, but that verse 10 is what is being quoted by John. We have God commissioning Isaiah saying, this is your ministry, okay? Go out, you're going to speak these things, and the result of your ministry is going to be to show or to render the hearts of these people unable to understand, their eyes blind, and their ears dull, okay? All right, so that's going to be your ministry, and honestly what he's saying is that you're going to have a ministry that no one's going to respond to, okay? That's what God is calling Isaiah to. Okay. Now at the end of then the book, Isaiah 53. So I'll just flip there. If you want to get there, you can. But Isaiah 53, verse 1. God speaking here with Isaiah to Isaiah, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Right. That's what John quotes. So when we put this in the context of what John is essentially saying, John's saying that that Isaiah's life, Isaiah's ministry, was a foreshadowing of Jesus' ministry. Right at the beginning of Isaiah's ministry, he was called to go forth and render these hearts unable to understand. All right, he gets to the end and of his ministry, and God's sitting there saying, who's believed the report? Just like I said, right? 50 years later, who's believed the report? No one's really believed the report. Jesus' ministry was much shorter than that, but we can also look at that. Not that no one believed. There was a significant number of people that obviously did believe. And that would be true of Isaiah. There was people that did believe and did understand the message that he was preaching, but it wasn't an overwhelmingly large percentage of the population. All right, but so Isaiah then is a foreshadowing of Jesus' ministry. Hey, Ben, how are you?
I'm doing good.
Good, come on in. We have another one of the chairs that you're sitting on. Mm-hmm. You know where it is?
Downstairs?
Downstairs. Exactly.
Would you like me to get it?
She's got it.
Me practicing. Oh, okay.
Don't fall down the stairs.
I'll try not to.
Okay, great. So anyway, so that's what we're seeing. I think that's some of the context of why John quotes these passages. Right? Now, I think that we would be it'd be well suited to look at verse 40 a little bit more carefully, because it does have some wording in it that can cause some difficulties, okay, in our understanding of who God is. And how you doing? You got to get some pound cake. It's super delicious.
You want it, but
And then there's that walnut stuff that you put on it. It's really wonderful.
yeah, there's
So-
all that stuff on it. And then if you need water, I didn't get it out, so just grab a cup and there's stuff in the fridge.
Yep. The walnut stuff. That's the technical name for it.
Stuff is yummy.
Walnut stuff. So, yeah. So anyway, but at verse 40, I think it causes, let's be honest, it causes theological difficulties, okay? When you look at the verse, it says, He has blinded their eyes and He hardened their hearts, lest they see with their eyes and perceive with their hearts and be converted and I heal them. So He has done it. And when you read it and then you just take it at face value, it sounds then like God has done this, that God has taken these people, that He's blinded them, that He's made them deaf, that they can't see, that they can't believe, and then He's going to hold them accountable for something that was none of their doing of their own and is going to send them to hell on that basis. Okay, that's, if you read it just at face value, that's what it looks like. Jan, yes.
What chapter and verse?
I'm looking at now John 12 back to verse 40. Yep. Yep. Yes. So we need to look at that. We need to try and understand that. And I think there's a couple of ways that we need to consider this. And there's a couple of ways that we need to understand this. Okay. And the first of these is to find out, is that appropriate, that God would do something like that? And I think that, should we stop? Should we have all the kids come up and get pound cake? Because here's what's going to happen. He's going to take pound cake down there, and then there's going to be trickling 6 kids come up at the same time.
We should. Who'd you bring up, Ian?
Yeah, let's stop.
Oh, Matt was.
Sorry, babe.
It's okay. I understand.
Why don't you go tell the kids there's
Go tell the kids. We should have done it before. Tell the kids.
Take a break.
I went down and I said,
I wonder what it's like for people listening to this online. I've never even thought about it. Anyway.
Val's listening to it. She's chuckling.
Yeah, exactly. Chuckling is part of it, I would imagine. Okay, so anyway, back to this verse 40. Okay, again, setting the context, when you look at this, it sounds like honestly God is doing this. God is on purposely blinding these people. Okay, and so I think that there's something that we need to look at. Okay, we need to look at, first of all, is He doing that in the order of events that would cause Him to do that? Okay, that's the first thing that we need to look at. And the second thing would be, well, how would He be doing that? Right, and try and understand it from that standpoint. And I think that when we look at those two things, that's going to bring some clarity to this verse. And also then, hopefully, it will clarify something about our Heavenly Father. Okay, because really you might be considering accusing Him of something that He really is not doing. Okay, and that's what we don't want to do, is that. All right, so first of all, let's look at it from this standpoint. The order of events, that if God were to then blind someone, or if He were to harden their hearts, what would be the status of that person's heart prior to God taking action on that? Okay, you'll notice that in verse 37 of this chapter 12, He says, "But though He performed so many signs before them, yet they were not believing Him." Okay, if you go back just even in this study alone, we had the man who was born blind, and we had the reaction of the ruling class of that day. Okay, and of many of that day, essentially, not only believing that the man wasn't who he said he was, and that he was born blind, they wouldn't believe his parents, and then even with his parents' testimony and his testimony, they still wouldn't believe. They were really resistant to believing that. Okay, that was their modus operandus, if you will. Okay, that's how they viewed this character Jesus. Okay, flip over to Matthew. Okay, and we'll expand this. Okay, Matthew. It is Matthew that I want to go to. Yes, Matthew 11, verse 20 through 24. Okay. So this is going to, again, describe groups of people that are surrounding Jesus, okay, in His ministry. So then he being Jesus, began to reproach the cities in which most of His miracles were done, because they did not repent. And this is what He said: "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles had occurred in Tyre and Sidon, which occurred in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Nevertheless, I say to you, it shall be more tolerable tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will not be exalted to heaven, will you? You shall descend to Hades, for if the miracles had occurred in Sodom, which occurred in you, it would have remained to this day. Nevertheless, I say to you that it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you. Right? So Jesus mentions 3 cities of his day, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum. All 3 of those bordered the northern shores of Galilee. Okay? Essentially, the center of his ministry, or what would be considered as Galilean ministry. Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, is about 30 to 40 miles north of Jerusalem. Okay. He mentions those 3 cities, but then he mentions Tyre, Sidon, and Sodom, which in the Old Testament, anyone at this period of time, Jesus' period of time, would have recognized those as cities that had undergone the wrath of God, okay, for the sins that they had committed. Okay, so they would have been cities that would have been judged. Right, so Jesus is essentially saying, well, geez, if they had had the opportunity to believe that you had been given the opportunity, then they would have repented long ago. Okay, so there's this understanding here as we look at this that these people were stiff-necked. They were hard of heart. They were unwilling to believe. Okay, now let's put that in light of then go way back. We're not going to read this because it would take far too long to do that. But if you look in Exodus, essentially chapter 7, all the way through to about Exodus 14, chapter 15, you'd see the description of Moses entering into the land of Egypt, proclaiming to Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, that he needed to let the Israelite nation, which had been in his nation for a long time and that he was essentially persecuting, that he needed to let them go. Of course, the Israelites were slaves of Pharaoh at this point in time. They had been enslaved by him, and they were very productive. Okay, cheap labor. It's hard to come by. Okay, so Moses went into that, and when you look at that, and of course this is a story that I think probably all of us are familiar with. Moses goes into Egypt. He performs miraculous, supernatural signs, what we call plagues, the 10 plagues of Egypt. And if you look in that account, through the first several plagues, Pharaoh is described as hardened in his heart. Okay, if you look in, and if you want to write these down, you can. We're not going to read them, but Exodus 7:13, chapter 7:23, chapter 8, verse 15, chapter 8:32, and chapter 9:34. Every single one of those verses says something to the effect that Pharaoh, seeing the sign that he had seen, hardened his heart. He took action and said, no, I am not letting them go. Okay. After that, the narrative continues through the rest of the plagues. And the narrative then goes on to say this in Exodus 10:1, Exodus 10:20, Exodus 10:27, Exodus 11:10, 14:4, and 14:8. After that, God is described as hardening the heart of Pharaoh. So what happened first was Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, and then after that, God hardens the heart, God hardens the heart, God hardens the heart, okay? So that it was really Pharaoh who had originally and initially hardened his heart, okay? And then to accomplish his purposes, God's purposes, he then hardened his heart further, and then of course, the rest is history. Okay, we have the Passover feast. The Israelites have the Passover feast because of this event. Okay, so anyway, so that's another example. Now let me read. We're going to read a long section of scripture here. I think is worth it though. Romans 1. Okay.
Exodus 4:21 actually says that he hardens the heart, but I'll harden his heart so that he won't let his people go.
Oh, okay. Okay. Which one was that? That was
Exodus 4:21.
4 or 14?
4.
Oh,
That's
4.
where
Okay.
God actually speaks them.
Okay. Okay. I didn't see that one. So, okay. So, Romans 1. There we go. Verse 18, we're going to read quite a bit of this, but I want to give the concept here and keep looking at this. Okay, so Paul speaking to the Romans, okay, Romans, the book of Romans, is a really challenging book. It's theologically very, what would be called dense. It's one of the more important books from just an understanding of what it means to obtain salvation through justification by grace. Okay, so very important book in the New Testament. Not always easy to understand because of the arguments that Paul makes. Okay, we're in the context of Romans 1. Paul is laying out an argument to essentially say that all of the human race is sinned. Okay, that's his argument. Okay, so starting in verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his internal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Paul is just saying that anyone, hey, how you doing? Good. So Paul is essentially saying that anyone can look around, all right, and see that that the world has been created, and can see God's works in that. He says he's clearly been made known to them. So, verse 21, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God. So now we're talking about the people, or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. So they have suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. They're suppressing that understanding that I can look around and see that there is God, that he created. Okay. Now, verse 24, therefore, God does something. He gave them over in the lust of their hearts to the impurity, that their bodies might be dishonored among them. So now God is doing something. In light of their suppression of the truth, he gives them over to something. Okay, for they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, again, God gave them. For what reason? Because they suppressed the truth in unrighteousness, right? God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for what is unnatural. And in the same way, the men abandoned the natural function of the women and burned in their desires towards one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not, so they, the people, they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God did what? God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper. And I could go on, but we see this back and forth, that these people suppress the truth in unrighteousness. God gives them over to something, right? So that's the idea. Okay, that and so what we see this all the way back in Moses' day. We see it in Isaiah's day, we see it in Jesus' day, and we see essentially Paul's depiction of the Greek world, okay, and the Jewish world in this way, that men have hardened their hearts, and then God gives them over to that. Okay, so that's I think that's first of all something that you need to understand, that it's not like, you know, a person that's willing and wants to know these things. God says, "No, I'm not blind you anyway." You know,
it almost seems just like the concept of free will, like.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It is I mean, that's exactly it, right? They through their own free will decisions have rejected him. And then in that, then he gives them up to, you know, whatever else they're going to go to, right? Whatever else is the consequence, if you will, of then their rejection of him. Okay, and that would be a life that would be a degrading life in many ways. Okay, so that's one, I think, thing that you need to look at. Now, the other thing that we need to think about with this, okay, and this is, I think, something that is very important. Try and understand this from God's point of view, okay? God knows something about all of us that we don't even know about ourselves, okay? Because he knows all things. He knows all the past, he knows all of the present, and he knows all of the future, right? So Becky and I have said that we're going to a wedding tonight. We have that in our minds. That's in our future, though. We don't know that with perfection. There could be something that occurs in the next hour or so that will prevent us from going to that wedding. For instance, the snowstorm could come back. So anyway, so there's something that could happen, right? So that would make us decide freely that to not go, right? I could have a free will decision. I'm like, oh, the weather reports in Denver are really bad. I didn't realize they were so bad. We're not going, okay? Now, God knew that better than I knew that. And let's say that is the eventuality of what happens, right? But my own free will decision was that I am not going to the wedding. But he knew that beforehand. Okay? Just because he knows it doesn't mean that I'm not choosing it freely. Okay, so that could be the case. Now, think about then Isaiah. So he commissions Isaiah, go back to our passage, and he says, okay, in God's mind, he knows. For the next 50 years, these people are not going to listen to you. Okay, so what am I going to have you do? I'm going to have you go and preach. And when you go and preach, you're going to render their hearts incapable of understanding, their eyes incapable of seeing, and their ears incapable of hearing. I know that's already in their heart. I'm going to have you, though, express those things so that it becomes clear to them and clear to everyone else that that is what is in their heart in the first place. Okay? God knows that. Okay? So he can see it from that perspective. Now, take that then. Is John then in verse 40? Right? Let's put this in the Jesus' day. Okay? Is John then in verse 40 taking that perspective? That God knew that Jesus' ministry would be rejected. Of course he knew that. I mean, he says that Jesus was crucified from the foundations of the world, and the crucifixion had to occur to save men. He knew that this was going to happen. Okay? So then by sending Jesus, the very act of sending Jesus, right, and the very then life that Jesus would live, the very words that he would speak, would then render their hearts unable to see, unable to hear, unable to understand, right? So then John takes a perspective that, okay, well, it's him that's doing it. That their hearts were already, they freely were going to reject Jesus Christ, and because he sent him into the world, then he just made manifest what he already knew was going to happen. Okay, that's, in my mind, probably one of the best explanations for this passage, that the actions of God just showed what was already in the heart of man. Okay? So, now, let me give a little bit of scripture behind that. Let's just flip over 1 or 2 pages to John 15. Okay? Chapter 15, verse 21. Okay? Jesus speaking, again, this is, in the context of then the Last Supper. Jesus speaking here, and he says this, verse 21, "But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them," speaking of the people that had rejected him and are rejecting him, "they would not have sinned. But now they have no excuse for their sin. He who hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works which no one else did, they would not have sinned. But now they have both seen and hated me and my Father as well." Okay, so when you look at that verse, okay, Jesus is saying that if I didn't come and do the things that I did, then they would have never known that they were rejected the Messiah. You talk to any one of those people that rejected him before Jesus ever showed up on the scene, and they would have said, "I'm looking for the Messiah. That's what I'm doing. I'm looking for Messiah. I'm looking for Messiah. I'm looking for Messiah." Right? And that would have been their life. Right? You see it even in Peter. He was looking for Messiah. Right? He said, "Jesus, you're Messiah." And then Jesus says, "That's right, I'm Messiah. And I'm going to go and I'm going to die." And then Peter says, "No way, you're not going to die." And what does Jesus say to him? "Wait a second. Right? Get behind me, Satan. Your thoughts are not the thoughts of God, but the thoughts of man." All right? And Peter had to have that revealed to him. Right? Well, just like these people, this is being revealed. They were without sin. They wouldn't have known that they were in that sin until they had been confronted with the things that Jesus had done, and then it was made clear to them, "We're not going to accept that guy. That's not what we want," because their hearts were the hearts of men and not of God's.
So you're saying that the process becomes extremely important for us on our side of things because it clarifies and pinpoints what we actually think about who he is.
Right.
And then you take that back into John 6, where that's the work that we have, is to know him as he is.
Right.
These things become extremely important, even though they're rough and sometimes hard. on us, but if they didn't happen, then we would go into eternity not knowing.
Not knowing.
Yeah.
That's right, exactly.
So-
And so God knows that's in the heart of people, and he's going to then reveal that to the heart of people.
Right.
Okay? And he just knows beforehand what's going to happen. Okay, so the ministry was going to be rejected by many, but it was going to be accepted by many. So it's getting loud again. Okay.
Joyous noise.
Yes, okay, exactly. All right, so that is, I think, I mean, it's a verse that's kind of hard, but it's a verse that I think that we can try and understand who God is and what he's doing, okay? We have to, when we encounter verses like this, it's important to fall back on something that we know, that God desires that all men would be saved. That's the first thing that we know. So then we have to say, okay, that's true of him, and we have very clear statements of that throughout the Old and New Testament, that he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. Okay, I mean, all those things, we go verse after verse after verse. So when we encounter something like this, we have to think, okay, what does that mean? Is God really like, I mean, is he really truly blinding someone, or is there something else going on that he sees that they're already blind, and the work that he's doing is just showing that they're blind? It's rendering their hearts blind. All right. Now, you do understand, we do have to look at the way that John quoted Isaiah 6 as a paraphrase. It's not the exact quotation. Look at the two. It's not that they aren't close to each other, but they're not the exact. Okay. In fact, many of the commentaries I looked at understand this is something about the New Testament. Many of the Old Testament passages that are quoted in the New Testament are actually quotations from something called the Septuagint. Okay, the Septuagint, or the LXX, L meaning 50, XX meaning 10 and 10, so that's 70. Okay, Septuagint was a Greek copy of the Old Testament that was put together by 70 scholars, Jewish scholars, around the first century AD, a little bit before that. Okay. Just before the time of Christ. So we call it the Septuagint because there's these 70 scholars that translated the Hebrew text into the Greek language, because Alexander the Great had taken over the world and the entire world was speaking Greek at that point in time. So we better have a Bible translated into the Greek. Right? So when we look at many Old Testament passages, it's actually a quotation directly from that, because the New Testament was written primarily in Greek. So it's a quotation from that. So what's interesting about verse 40 of John is neither a direct translation of the Hebrew version of Isaiah 6:10, nor is it a direct translation of the LXX or the Septuagint. It's a paraphrase. Okay, and so John kind of puts his own spin on this, if you will. Okay. Again, I think inspired by the Holy Spirit to do so. So, okay, all right. So now I think that's it. I mean, for that. I mean, that's a lot for that one verse, so that should be it, I think, unless you guys have comments, thoughts. So, okay. Now, verse 42 and 43, let's just finish this up. Nevertheless, given all this that we've said, nevertheless, many even of the rulers believed in him. Okay, so some of these people did believe. But because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God. They were afraid of men. Right? And that's what that means, right? So, and honestly, that verse is one of the more convicting verses in my life. It might be for you as well. How many times have you found yourself saying something or not saying something, or doing something or not doing something, because you're more worried about the eyes that are peering at you rather than the one who knows you and created you? Right? You have a fear of man rather than a fear of God. And I know that's been true in my life, and I'm sure that's probably true in your lives as well. Okay, so that's what's being expressed in that. Okay, now verse 44 through verse 50. You heard me at the very beginning of this say that verse 36 probably the last words of Jesus, right? Public words of Jesus. And now we come to verse 44, and John says, and Jesus cried out and said. And then there's the rest of these verses, and you think, oh, he's wrong. I'm wrong. It's either that, and I think that what's actually being done here, and I read lots of commentaries on this. These are words certainly spoken by Jesus, okay? But what I think that John has done is that he has taken those words that were spoken of Jesus and he has placed them right here, right before chapter 13, course, he didn't write in chapters, right? He just wrote as a kind of stream of thought. But he knew he was transitioning into something different, okay? And so what he does is he sums up everything that he's done prior to this, saying, these are the words of Jesus, okay? In fact, if you look at the concepts that are talked about in verses 44 through 50, they're concepts that we've gone over and over and over again in these first 12 chapters. Okay, I'll just read this off real quickly. You don't have to write this down or anything. I can give you this lift at the end of this. But the concepts in verse 44 through 45 were covered in chapter 5, verse 34, chapter 5, verse 36, chapter 7, verse 16, chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, chapter 7, 37, chapter 8, verse 19, chapter 10, verse 38. So we've gone over this. This is territory that we're familiar with. Verse 46, it's covered in chapter 3, 19, 8, 12, 9, 5, 9, 39, 12, 35 through 36. Did you get that one?
Nope.
That's for earlier, Alex.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll share this with you. But anyway, verse 47 through 48, John chapter 3, 16 through 20, John chapter 5, verses 45, 8, and chapter 8, verse 50, and then finally 49 through 50, John chapter 5, 30, chapter 6, 35 through 36, chapter 7, 16 through 17, chapter 7, 28 through 29, and chapter 8, 26 through 38. Big sections. And you think to yourself, did you miss any of the verses from chapters 1 through 12? Maybe a few that were not quite said in that. But this is a summary of everything that Jesus has said and everything that John has tried to point out in the first 12 chapters. Okay, so that's where we're headed. Now, I do want to take a little bit of time and look at it. We won't spend a ton of time on it, but I do think it's important to kind of look at it, because I think that what also is summarized in this is the gospel message, the good news. Right? And the very heart of God is spoken in this. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this. Verse 44, it says, "He who believes in me does not believe in me, but in him who sent me. And he who beholds me beholds the one who sent me." So the very first part of the gospel, one of the very first things that we have to understand about the good news, is that God took it upon himself to explain himself to men. Okay, imagine this. Imagine Christianity without Jesus. I mean, you can't really do it, but imagine Christianity without the physical man that we know as Jesus Christ. Imagine trying to follow a God that you really don't have a context for. There's not an image of him. There's nothing to really tangibly sink yourself into in terms of God. That's what the nation of Israel was doing in the Old Testament. They had a temple, certainly. And they had the law, but they didn't really have the man Jesus Christ, right? I find it so refreshing to be able to relate to God in the sense that I can envision myself walking next to him because he's a man, right? And I can lay hands on him, and I can touch him, and I can feel him, I can hear him. Those things are tangible to me, right? If you look at John chapter 1:18. It says that Jesus came into the world to explain God. I mean, the word is not quite explain, but that's the sense of John chapter 1:18, that he came in to explain God. Okay, the incarnation, the fact that God would take on human flesh, screams out that I am willing to reveal myself to people. I want people to know who I am. I want them to know my heart, if they would be willing to just accept my words. That's what the incarnation tells us. That's what the gospel starts off with, is that there's a God that loves us and wants to know us, and he's willing to take drastic measures to do so. He's willing to, I mean, think about it. God came into this world as a baby and had to rely on his mom, Mary, to keep him alive, the creator of the world, right? And that's a pretty remarkable step down. If you think about God, I mean, becoming reliant upon one of your creatures to keep you alive, your physical being alive. Okay, so that's...
And they knew that before they did the creative act.
Right, exactly.
Which is incredible. He knew he was going
He knew he would do that. Right, exactly.
And they did it anyways.
And they did it anyways. Okay, so that's the very first part of this, and that's what he's saying. He says, he who believes in me does not believe in me, but the one who sent me. I was sent. I was sent from heaven. Okay. Now, verse 46. Okay. I have come as light into the world, that everyone who believes in me may not remain in darkness. All right, so darkness, let's focus on that. The second part of the gospel message is that God came into the world to explain who God was, and or Jesus came into the world to explain who God was, and his message was that men are sinners. Okay, you have to accept that. That's central to understanding who Jesus is. Okay, right. So if you look at this, let's see here. I wasn't planning on reading this, but it struck me as I was doing this. Right after the man born blind gets healed, he says this. John chapter 9, verse 39. Okay? So Jesus says, "For judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind." Those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, "We are not blind too, are we?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains." Right? A person that is unwilling to accept the very fact that they are in darkness and that they can't see and that they are indeed sinners is not going to be able to see. Right? And that's what he's saying here. Okay? That's the second part of the message, is that men are sinners. And that's screamed out we looked in Romans 1. We don't have to read the whole thing again. But we were looking in Romans 1. Paul describes it, okay, to us, I think, pretty well in that. Okay? Right now, but and this is the good message, right? This is the good news. "But I have come as a light into the world, that everyone who believes in me may not remain in darkness." So there's a choice. And there's a free will decision that all men can believe in him. Okay, so that's, again, this unfolding of this message. Okay, now verses 47 through 48. Okay, "And if anyone hears my sayings and does not keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. He who rejects me and does not receive my sayings has one who judges him. The word I spoke is what will judge him at the last day." So that same concept that I was talking about in the verse above, right? He came, he spoke his words so that those words then would reveal the hearts of men. Okay? If you look in John 3, John 3 is pretty popular. John 3, let's read verses 19 through 20. Okay? Just below one of the most famous statements of the entire book of the Bible. Okay? John 3 verses 19 says this, "And this is the judgment, that the light is come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds be exposed." Right? So Jesus saying here that I've come into the world as light, and the thing that judges the world is that they love darkness rather than me. Okay? Then he goes on in verses 49 through 50 of our passage right now. "For I did not speak on my own initiative, but the Father himself who sent me has given me commandment, what to say and what to speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. Therefore the things I speak just as the Father has told me." Go back to chapter 3. You see the same thing here. Go back up to 16 and give the context of verses 19 and 20. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have what? Eternal life." Okay? "For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but that through the world, but that the world should be saved through him. He who believes in him is not judged, but who does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son." Okay, and then he goes on to say that men love darkness. So that's the gospel message, that he came into the world to explain God, and that the world can either accept the light, and in accepting the light, that means it has to expose them as sinners, but that God is willing to do that and willing to save them, willing to forgive them of that, and go on, or they're going to reject it and they're going to remain in darkness. Okay, and that's all that's all summed up for us at the very end of chapter 12 here. Okay, and we move then into now chapter 13, the Last Supper, And then, of course, his trial, his crucifixion, his burial, and his resurrection, okay, which is, of course, the central component of the gospel message, which is spoken of in this chapter, okay? All right.
And by central, do you mean it just had to happen? Because
Becky, I know where you're going with this. Okay, go ahead.
okay. You already know. You could just.
No, I want you to say it.
Well, I mean, I never really understood that phrase, right? Like
Central.
that this is the central. He had that his death and his coming into the world is central, and I understand how that it is, but the whole thing is central, and this is an aspect that absolutely had to take place, just like creation absolutely had to take place.
Yes.
So that could be considered central. Or so I guess I'm just wondering where that phrase, like, why do we have that phrase in our Christianity lingo, that this is central?
Well, when you look at when you look at salvation, I guess I would say that when you look at salvation and God's plan of salvation, salvation cannot come to men without the death and resurrection of Christ. Right? So when you talk about central to his plan of salvation, right, that is the means by which salvation is provided. That's what
Right.
centrality means. It's true, though, that central to the gospel message, it's hard to say one thing is more important than the other, right? I mean, if God didn't create, then you wouldn't have man, and you couldn't certainly have sin then, right? Central to that message is that men are sinners and they rejected him. Central to that message is that God then sent his son into the world, right? And on we go. So it is true that there's not any one aspect of the gospel that is more important than the other. But when you think about a plan of salvation, it's not the law.
Well, obviously,
It's not
a
the
huge piece of it. I mean, he sweats blood over it. I mean,
Right.
it's a huge physical, feat that's happening. So I'm not trying to put that into question.
right.
But I find that phrase interesting.
Well, it's the centerpiece of his earthly ministry. I mean, it all culminated
I
in
would
that.
think the resurrection would be the centerpiece.
Well,
I
yeah.
would want to think
Well, of course, the resurrection. I mean, of course, you're right.
alive.
You're right. Right. Right.
Okay. Anyways.
Okay.
Okay. I just think it's important sometimes because
Yeah.
then I think that then people get fixated on one thing and we miss all of it, right? Like I think so many people in Christianity are just kind of in the back of their mind of, yeah, he died, he came, he died. And they don't take this whole aspect of all that he did, starting from the very beginning and setting up the nation of Israel and then showing them the rock and the desert and just all of it and how it's all so linked together and how he's just marching through time and that time is still marching on and he still has things for us to, that he's already put out there, like this is going to happen and then this is going to happen and then you're going to look up and the cloud is going to, the sky is going to render in two and I'm going to come.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think central, like how do you pick central out of,
Well, many of the things that you described in the Old Testament, though, are arrows pointing to this very event,
yeah, him.
right? Center, right? I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I mean, I hear what you're saying.
Right.
But, I mean, it is true
Kind of
that
semantic, but I
yeah.
do think that the semantic kind of trips people up a little bit.
Well,
Where
I
they
understand.
look at one thing and they don't look at
Well, if a person is willing, yes, to say that, we can forget about the rest of the Bible as long as we just kind of center in on those Gospels
Yeah.
and the gospel message, then we can ignore the rest, and that would be to their detriment because then they wouldn't understand who God is in totality, right? And his desire and how he's been seeking that. So, okay,
That's a death trap right there.
Legos.
Yes,
Legos.
stepping on a Lego with your
it's
bare foot,
horrible.
it's
Yeah.
awful.
Okay.
Now let me do one more thing. Okay, let me do this. I handed these out. Let's do this. Okay.
Any exercise?
Did you get one? Wait a second. We have another one for you. Oh, there we go. Okay, so there is something before we head into this, and I'd rather deal with this now than some other time. Okay, and so we're going to venture into chapter 13. We're going to read like 6 words, and that will be it. Okay, so chapter 13, verse 1 says this: Now before the feast of the Passover, and that's all I'm going to cover. Okay, before. The key word there being before the feast of the Passover. Okay, now, what's that?
Nothing?
7 words. Is that what he said? He said 7 words. It's
Well-
6 in the Greek. All right. Now, Luke. Go to Luke. Where is it? Luke 22.
We've got so much going on today.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry.
This is a. Okay, anyway.
Doing great, babe.
Luke 22, verses 7, and we're going to read more than 7 words or 6 words. And I'm not going to even guess at how many we're going to read. Okay, so I'm just going to read this real quickly. Luke 22, verse 7, Then came the first day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it. And they said to him, Where do you want us to prepare it? And he said to them, Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house that he enters, and you shall say to the owner of the house, The teacher says to you, Where is the guest room in which I may eat what? The Passover with my disciples. And he will show you a large furnished upper room. Prepare it there. And they departed and found everything just as he had told them, and they prepared what? The Passover. Right? Now, verse 14. And when the hour had come, he reclined at the table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Now, if you look at Luke 7, we could do the same thing in Matthew, and we could do the same thing in Mark. That whole setup is them preparing for the Passover. He reclines at the table, okay, to eat the Passover. He says to them, I've longed to eat the Passover with you. All right? As we go through, starting in chapter 13, you'll see him reclining at the table. They'll be eating a supper, okay? But John says, oh, it's before the Feast of Passover. But there will be no one that would look at what's happening and described in John 13 and what is described in Luke 7, the chapter that we just read, Luke 22, and Matthew and Mark, as being separate events. They're the same event. They're the Passover meal that he has. So why does John say before? Okay, and this is one of those things that we do have to look at when you start comparing the gospel accounts one to another. You're going to come across things that make you go, that's not like quite, it doesn't quite go together. It doesn't quite mesh. So this would, on the surface, appear to be an apparent contradiction. Either John's wrong, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke are wrong. But they can't both be right? So, but in this case, they are kind of both right. Okay, so here's what we're going to have to do. Okay, what you have to do when you run into something like this is you have to seriously consider what was going on in the first century. Okay, and so that's why I handed this out, because there's no way to explain this without this little diagram. At least in my mind, there wasn't. So what you see all the way to the left on my little diagram is you see the word modern. Okay, and then you see those dotted lines, and it says 12 a.m., 6 a.m., 12 p.m., 6 p.m., 12 a.m., and there's these 24-hour periods that are shown here. Okay, our calendar, okay, the day starts at 12 a.m. and it ends at 11:59 p.m. Okay, and you see here in that modern it says Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Okay, now the ancient world was not like that. The ancient world was a very, very different world in very different ways. There was, at the minimum, at least 2 different ways to consider when a day started and when a day began. When a day started and when a day began. And ended, okay? One of those would have been how Galileans, okay, would have perceived a day beginning and ending. They would have said that about 6 a.m. is when the day starts, when the sun is rising. When the sun goes down, about 6 p.m., that's when the day was ending. Okay, so that's how they would have considered. I'm sorry, the day was not ending. It would have been, the 24-hour period would have been 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. Okay, sunrise to sunrise. Yeah, that's Galileans. Judeans, which was about 35 miles south of them, okay, would have considered the day beginning at 6 p.m. and ending at 6 p.m. the next day, 24 hours. Okay. Now, that's a little bit weird, but when you think about it from one standpoint, these people were actually quite isolated from one another. It's not like they called each other on a daily basis and they texted one another. They didn't have any of that. 35 miles seemed like a pretty trivial distance until you walk it. Okay, and then when you walk it, you think to yourself, wow, I'm like 2 days away from getting to my end destination. These are pretty isolated communities, Galileans and Judeans. Okay, so what we have in the middle here, Galilean calendar, the Galileans' account of how a day began and ended. Okay, we have that mapped over Thursday and Friday, and we also have then you see 14 in Nisan and 15 in Nisan. Okay, Nisan was the month. Okay, it was a Jewish month. And the Levitical law said that the Passover lamb should be slaughtered, crucified, on the 14th of Nisan, okay, to celebrate the Passover feast, right? This is the not Jesus. We're talking about the lamb, okay, that they would have been eating, and that would have been part of the preparation. That event would have taken place at about 3 p.m. Would have started at about 3 p.m. Okay, and would have gone until all the Passover lambs for all the people who were celebrating the feast at that time would have been done. Okay, now understand something. This was no small undertaking. Josephus, another ancient writer, extra-biblical writer, said that about 270,000 lambs were crucified every Passover. 270,000. That's a lot of animals. Okay, when you start to think about it, how long would it take to do one? Okay, right? I mean, they cut the throat, they had to bleed it out. Okay, it was not a trivial process. So that's going to take a long time. Okay, now, so when we start to think about Jesus and what we read in Luke, okay, and his disciples saying, well, where do you want us to prepare the Passover? That would have started, their preparation, that would have been early in the morning that they were talking about it, about 6 a.m., maybe 7 a.m., whenever they woke up, right? And that would have been on their minds. Today's Passover, we've got to prepare the Passover. The Galilean calendar. They're looking at the Galilean calendar, okay? At about 3 p.m., their lamb, let's say that they were, got in line, they did good, they got in line really early. At about 3 p.m., their lamb is slaughtered, okay? They then bring that, they cook that, and then they start to have that meal with Jesus together in the upper room as is described. Okay, all happening on that Thursday night, what we would have called Thursday night. Okay, so that's what's going on. Now, as it went into the mornings of the 14th of Nisan, where it would transition to us for Friday at about 12 a.m., the wee hours of that morning is when Jesus would have been betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. He would have been then put on trial. These would have been things that were happening before the sun had risen. Okay, and he would have been probably whipped, beaten early in the morning, probably before 6 a.m., was probably on the cross somewhere around 8 to 9 a.m., okay, on what we would have called Friday. Okay, what they would have called, the Galileans would have called the 15th of Nisan, he would have been hanging on the cross, but what would have, now let's shift our gaze over to the right, what the Judeans would have considered the 14th of Nisan, which is when they would have started doing the Passover. Okay, so Jesus is hanging for the Judeans on the cross on the 14th of Nisan. They're preparing their Passover meal. Okay, they're going through the same process that the day prior the disciples had taken part in with Jesus. Okay, and then so about 3 p.m. they start sacrificing their animals. Now, this also is a convenient way of describing how can they get 270,000 lambs crucified in one day. They didn't. They did it over a 2-day period of time. Okay? And so when John says before the Passover, he's strictly just speaking from a Judean calendar standpoint. He's saying from their standpoint, this was before the Passover. Okay? We're celebrating the Passover with them from a Galilean standpoint. Understand that John wrote almost exclusively about the Judean ministry, Jesus' Judean ministry, okay? Whereas Luke, in particular, wrote almost exclusively about the Galilean ministry of Jesus, okay? Now, there's, of course, crossover. Luke has to describe the crucifixion, which, of course, occurred in Jerusalem, Judean, right? And there are things that John, of course, talks about that occurred in Galilee. But their focus would have been these two different sects of people, okay? So, while there is this apparent contradiction, it's really not that big of a contradiction when you consider it this way. Okay. Now, we don't have any explanation from John or Luke and said, oh yeah, by the way, Luke is describing it this way and John, I'm describing it this way. They don't do that. Okay. They assume that the reader that would have been reading this would have understood what they were trying to say, because those people would have been used to this, right? I mean, it's kind of like what we're used to. I mean, think about New Year's Eve. Paris has celebrated the incoming new year before we ever did, right? You guys probably, none of you would remember Y2K because you do? Okay.
I have a very good memory.
You haven't,
It's hilarious.
okay, yeah, so, Y2K was this real, like, we're all worried that the calendar, I mean, we're going to flip over to 00 and the entire computers of the entire world are going to shut down and everything's going to, it's going to be disaster. It's going to be disaster.
Going back to 1870s.
Exactly, tonight. And so, everyone's worried about that. And as the calendar starts to flip and nothing's happening, right? So we all understand by the time by the time we're hitting that in the United States, it's like nothing to worry about because it's already happened, right? Now, of course, we're separated by long distances, but it's that kind of an idea, okay, that these events were being described as just 12 hours differences in how they interpreted their day to start and end. So.
Well, what's really interesting to me is that he would have been on the cross dying at 3 p.m. according to the Judean calendar. So the Passover lamb, according to the Judean calendar, was being killed.
He would have actually been, so they would have made sure that he was dead before 3 p.m. They wanted to make sure that he was dead and gone. That's why they broke his legs. Or they didn't have to break, that's why they were breaking, that's why they wanted to break his legs. But they broke the legs of those other ones being crucified because they wanted to get them off the crosses so that they could go on with their preparation. He was already dead though, yes. Yep.
And I just think it's interesting that took place during that time.
That's right.
Because I always think
That's right.
it's neat that way.
So we can now go on with the rest of John 13 through 17 and not worry about these oddities that you might find if you start reading the other accounts and the other gospels. Like, wait a second, this doesn't quite jive. It can jive, okay, and I think this is one of the better ways of explaining it. I looked at several different ways of explaining it. There are lots of different opinions on how do we explain these contradictions. This is the one that, for me, was the most compelling. The other ones, I mean, there's some merit to them. I just didn't find them as compelling. So anyway.
I think it's also interesting to note, and I don't know, maybe did you say this when I was out of the room, of how Jesus quotes Isaiah from...
I didn't say that, no.
From
He doesn't quote it. John does.
Well, yeah. So John quotes from Isaiah 6 and Isaiah 53.
Yeah. Isaiah 53.
Which is important because why?
Well, we talked a little bit about it last week. The Deutero-Isaiah theory.
Yeah.
The fact that there's many skeptical critics of the Old Testament that say that Isaiah had to be written by two different individuals because there's no way that the individual that written the first 39 chapters of Isaiah could have written the last 40, from I guess the 26 chapters of Isaiah, because stylistically they're different, and also the events that are described in Isaiah 40 to 66 could not have been described by a person that was living during the times that the original Isaiah was said to live, because men can't see into the future. And Isaiah 40 through 66 has very future tense descriptions of things. So what Becky is saying is that, in the New Testament we have here then a description by a first century person that says, inspired by the Holy Spirit, that says that Isaiah, the entire book of Isaiah was written by the prophet Isaiah. Chapter 6 and chapter 53.
Which is important because you can
It
spend, depending on what kind of a person you are, you can spend hours and hours and hours trying to, these things can really trip you up and bring you to a point of, well, what if there were two different Isaiahs, or depending on your personality type. So